A greeting of a pleasant day, everyone. I am Janna Nuqui, and I am welcoming all of you to our today's discussion, the Acuña's Philosophical Analysis, Unit 3, Module 1, and Unit 4, Modules 1 and 2. This presentation will revolve on answering questions like, what differentiates formal logic from the informal ones? Are there standards to follow? And what distinguishes valid from invalid arguments? What is the importance of all those things? I remember a quote from Sherlock Holmes saying, "It is a capital mistake to theorize before you have all the evidence. It biases the judgment." This may be a brief statement, yet it leaves a deep lesson. To learn more about the significance of these lines, let me officially start our discussion by enumerating the objectives of Unit 3, Module 1, Analysis of Deductive Argument. Opposite to inductive, deductive argument is a top-down approach that creates inferences by going from general premises to specific conclusions. Thus, a deductive argument is a type of reasoning which can be considered as the most unfamiliar one, for it is abstract and counterintuitive. But in spite of that, deductive logic can offer us indispensable skills required in philosophical analysis. So, after completing this module, you should be able to first, discuss the subject matter of formal deductive logic. Second, explain the structure of a deductive argument. Third, discuss the definition of a deductive argument. Fourth, distinguish valid from invalid argument form. And lastly, explain the nature and essence of deductive arguments. Now moving on to the discussion proper, what is FDL? FDL is the formal deductive logic wherein its subject matter can be defined in a variety of ways, depending upon the disposition of the logician. However, the common detail among those definitions is that formal deductive logic is the study of valid and invalid argument forms. Hence, these formal logicians believe that the essence of all arguments can be found in their argument forms. Here is an example of a deductive argument. The structure of a deductive argument consists of a premise or a premise set and a conclusion, wherein there is no maximum number of premises, but bear in mind that one argument must only have one conclusion. In the presented example, statements 1 and 2 are the premises, while statement 3 is the conclusion. Consequently, the premises and the conclusion of the argument are either true or false only, obeying the principle of excluded middle, which states that a statement can have only two truth values, either it is true or it is false and nothing else. Consider it as if implying that a third value, presumably the probability, is not an option in this analysis. There is no middle ground between being true and being false. Now, in judging whether the argument form is valid or invalid, formal logicians ought to set aside the content of all naturally occurring arguments in the ordinary discourse by means of representation, so that they can solely focus and concentrate on the argument's logical form. This representation is commonly written in a vertical manner. And here is an example of a logical structure. Now, comparing the two structures, we can vividly see that in revealing the logical structure of an argument, its content, which in this example is Fido and the puppy, was discarded and changed as P and Q that represent each claim. Thus, this argument form is named modus ponens. Modus ponens is a Latin phrase meaning method of affirming. It is a rule of inference used to draw logical conclusions, which states that if P is true and if P implies Q, then Q is true. All arguments under this form are considered valid. An argument form is valid if the premises, regardless of the statements used in their substitutes, are all true. Then the conclusion must also be true. Observe that the validity of an argument is determined irrespective of the content of the premises and the conclusion. Dahil nga sa formal logic, ang mas pinagtutuunan ng pansin ng mga logicians ay yung logical structure ng mga argument kaysa sa mismong content nito. Conversely, if you have a case where the premise set is true and the conclusion is false, then the argument form is now invalid. Modus ponens has a corresponding invalid form. This is called affirming the consequent. All arguments with this form are invalid regardless of their content. This form indicates that the premise set is true and the conclusion is false. Hence, determining the validity and invalidity of an argument will be thoroughly discussed later on in P9, Unit 3, Module 7. Now, gathering all the aforementioned data, A deductive argument is defined as a type of reasoning made up of a premise or a premise set and a conclusion such that in all possible substitution instances of the truth values of the premises and conclusion, you will not have a case in its truth table where the premise set is true and the conclusion is false. This means that the argument form is valid. If you do, then the argument form is invalid. To easily grasp the idea, just keep in mind that the formal concept of an invalid argument is nothing but a combination of the truth values of the premises and a conclusion where it happens that the premise set is true and the conclusion is false. Similarly, the formal concept of a valid argument has no combination of truth values where the premise set is true and the conclusion is false. Do not be confused of the words that I have just said, for it is a type of an argument form called tautology. Regardless of the truth or falsity of the constituent phrases, a tautology is a logical combination of statements that is always true. It's like repeating the same term but it conveys different meanings. Continually, an argument where the premise set is false and the conclusion is also false is still valid. Moreover, in all other possible combinations of truth values of the premise set and the conclusion, the argument form is considered valid. For instance, if the premise set is false and the conclusion can either be true or false, then the argument form remains valid. Another, if the conclusion is true and the premise set can either be true or false, then the argument form is still valid. But please do take note that in this context, the concepts of true and false are analytic, not empirical. As a matter of fact, to avoid the empirical interpretations associated with the terms, some formal logicians use the symbol 1 for true and 0 for false instead. These formal logicians are not interested in the empirical or evaluative components of the premises and the conclusions. Rather, their concern mainly consists of the logical forms of the arguments, whether they are valid or invalid argument forms. With this being said, we can notice that the goal of formal logic is to uncover the essence of all arguments. Consequently, the concept of argument form affirms that an argument form is either valid or invalid, wherein there are no degrees of validity involved. That is why formal logicians have concentrated their study on the logical form of the arguments, leaving its natural setting or the ordinary language behind. Accordingly, formal logic was not intended to aid us in understanding the kinds of arguments occurring in natural languages. However, it helps us identify valid arguments and avoid the invalid ones. These invalid argument forms are generally known as formal fallacies. And with this, we have reached the end of Unit 3, Module 1. Moving along, we have here Unit 4, Module 1, Analysis of Natural Argument. Contrastingly, we also have the so-called natural argument that occurs in ordinary discourse. The objectives. After completing this module, you should be able to first, differentiate the subject matter of formal logic from informal logic. Second, explain the subject matter of informal logic. And lastly, discuss the counterexamples of the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Now, the subject matter of informal logic consists of the contents that were discarded when an argument is represented. Kabaliktaran naman ito ng formal logic. In this situation, yung contents naman yung pinagbibigyang halaga. Hence, informal logicians study arguments in their natural setting which pertains to the arguments that occur in the ordinary discourse. O ito yung mga mas common na pinag-uusapan sa araw-araw nating pamumuhay. According to Govier, natural language deals with topics of controversy, disputed facts, plausible hypotheses, and approximately correct analogies. At para naman ma-evaluate sila, kailangan nating isort out lahat ng ambiguities. Also, we must see how diverse factors fit together, weigh their pros and cons, at i-consider yung credibility of those on whom we may depend credibility and expertise na hindi na-address ng formal logic. As this form occurs in a natural setting, this logic then identifies, interprets, analyzes, and evaluates arguments with the help of Wittgenstein's language games. Sa tulong ng language games, in the formal logic, hindi na kailangan pang sumunod sa any template ng formal logic. At dahil na rin diverse ang domain ng informal logic, malaki talaga ang naitutulong ng language games sa pagka-classify at pagka-assert ng arguments because it is important that the discourse is language game specific para maiwasan din ang complications at misunderstandings. Now moving on to the analysis of the context of the argument. We have here an example of affirming the consequent na sa perspective ng formal logic ay isang invalid argument. However, if you thoroughly analyze the argument's contents, you will be able to notice that the claim in statement 3 is supported by statements 1 and 2. On the other hand, we also have an example of the valid form of modus ponens. Here, the argument form is considered valid, but if you again thoroughly analyze the argument's contents, you will be able to notice that the conclusion does not follow its two premises. Sa first argument ang sabi, if it rains, ang dam will be full. Ang dam is full, therefore it rained. Samantalang sa second argument, if it rains, ang dam will be full. It rained, therefore ang dam is full. Dito kahit na invalid yung form ng first statement sa language games ng formal logicians, we can affirm na true yung conclusion ng argument alinsunod sa nilalamang detalye ng premises nito. Samantala, ang modus ponens sa formal logicians ay isang valid argument. Pero sa pagkakataong ito, makikita natin na may chance na mali yung conclusion na ang dam is full dahil hindi ibig sabihin na dahil lang umulan ay automatic na mapupuno yung ang dam. Dahil hindi fixed yung lakas ng ulan, maaaring umulan nga pero hindi naman ganoong kalakas na kayang punuin yung dam. Tulad nga ng sabi ko, the intensity of the rain can be various. It could be light or heavy rainfalls at saka pwede ring short or long yung rain periods. So, kung ang basis mo lang ay yung statement na it rained, you cannot immediately conclude that the dam is full. Therefore, we can say that in the informal logic, the logical argument forms are not necessary and reliable. We must still observe and look at its content, for the conclusions can only be accepted true if it follows the premises provided. Now, here are more counter-examples showing that when you examine the content of an argument, you will be able to discover that the conclusion is strongly supported by the premises. First, we have example A. First statement, if the figure is a triangle, then it is a geometric figure with 3 sides and 3 angles. Second statement, the figure is a geometric figure with 3 sides and 3 angles. So, statement 3, therefore, the figure is a triangle. Next is example B. If that man is a bachelor, then that man is an unmarried male. Second, that man is an unmarried male. Third, so therefore, that man is a bachelor. Last example, example C. If I have the flu, then I have a fever. Second statement, I have a fever. Therefore, I have a flu. Ito yung mga halimbawa na mapapaisip tayo na, oo nga, tama naman. Pero at some point, kapag ating inanalyze na mabuti, using the formal logic, maiisip natin yung mga possibilities na hindi siya accurately correct. Higit pa rito, pinapakita ng mga halimbawang nabanggit na kung logical form lamang ang bibigyan natin ng pansin, ay hindi na natin pagtutuunan na suriin ang nilalamang detalye ng mga argumento. Thus, we would never even bother to assess the arguments in this form. Now, in consideration of all the mentioned details, we can come up with a definition of informal logic as a branch of logic whose task is to develop non-formal standards by inspecting the contents of all the arguments. Thus, it suggests that the premises are true, at yung truth na conclusion ay makukumpirma lang sa truth ng premises. This non-deductive way in which premises confirms the truth of a conclusion is the subject matter of informal logic. Again, informal logic is not concerned with the logical form of any argument. Their main concern is focused on various types of content in different language games. Thus, searching for an argument's essence in the ordinary discourse is impossible. So we must follow Wittgenstein's advice to look and see and don't think. For the common mistake of formal logicians is claiming that it is either deductive yung argument mo or else it is defective, and then they will start rejecting all non-deductive arguments as counterfeit arguments. Thus, again, we must keep in mind that the family resemblance of traits and characteristics may help us provide the purpose of classifying arguments in the ordinary discourse. With that, Unit 4 Module 1 ends here. And last but not the least, we have the Unit 4 Module 2, the Theory of Argument. Objectives. After completing this module, you should be able to first discuss the theory of argument. Second, differentiate the theory of analysis and the theory of appraisal. Third, differentiate the 3 types of arguments. And lastly, determine where the strength of the argument rests. The theory of argument is assumed to be composed of a step-by-step procedure similar to a computer template that is intended to provide a set of analytic skills for composing an argument, including the metacognitive skills of criticizing the composed argument which becomes the preparation for composing a counter-argument and then proceeding to the megacognitive skills of evaluating the strengths of the original argument with regards to the counter-argument so that the weaker one could be strengthened. Hence, the theory of argument is composed of the theory of analysis and the theory of appraisal. The theory of analysis consists of a definition of an argument and its typology, while the theory of appraisal consists of a proposal of how an argument is to be criticized and evaluated. Now, we have here the model of Ralph Johnson illustrating the theory of arguments. Let's start with discussing the theory of analysis. The theory of analysis supplies answer to questions how an argument is to be defined, what is the purpose of an argument, and lastly, how many types of arguments are there. Now, ano nga ba ang argument? Let's begin with the definition of an argument. It is said that an argument is any discourse, pwedeng pabigkas o pasulat, kung saan some statements are used as reasons, justifications, or evidence na may tungkuling patatagin o magbigay suporta sa claim na nakasaad sa panibagong statement. Thus, the claim of the statement may be true, false, or probable. Also, it could be something good or bad, right or wrong, and desirable or undesirable. Ngayon naman, ano ang bumubuo sa arguments? Katulad ng sinabi sa discussion sa Unit 3, Module 1, arguments consist of discourse used to support a claim. Ito yung tinatawag na premise. At ang discourse supported by the premise naman ay tinatawag na claim. With that, the basic aim of informal logic here is to first understand how a conclusion is supported by the premises, and to develop the criteria for judging whether the support given by the premise is very strong, fair, weak, or poor. The practice of argumentation is said to be teleological, wherein the argumentations have the purpose of achieving a certain goal. Thereupon, we can say that an argument is successful if it has served its intended goal. Ma-achieve lang yung goal na to once na na-accept na yung conclusion na based sa premises offered. However, as critical thinkers, we are not supposed to accept the conclusion of any argument unless the premises are evaluated as very strong support. Ngayon naman, ma-achieve ang purpose ng isang argument if and only if it can persuade a critical thinker. Moving on, we have here the types of arguments. First, we have the empirical argument. An empirical argument may have a conclusion that is based on an opinion, belief, or knowledge claim that can be true, false, or probable, kung saan yung premises niya ay kinakailangan makapag-provide ng evidence in order to verify the truth or probability of the conclusion. Example statement: most politicians are corrupt because all the politicians I'm acquainted with are all corrupt. Kinongclude mo ayon sa iyong paniniwala na lahat ng politicians ay corrupt dahil nga lahat ng kakilala mong politicians ay corrupt. This argument is commonly called as a fallacy of hasty generalization. Moving on, we have the analytic argument. It is said that an analytic argument has a claim that is supported by an analytic definition, like a well-formed formula of some formal science. Example statement: this piece of land must be a triangle because it contains 3 sides and 3 angles. Yung analytic definition dito ay, all triangles have 3 sides and 3 angles. Now for the third type of argument, we have the evaluative argument. An evaluative argument has a conclusion claim that can be act, behavior, or event that is either good or bad, right or wrong, moral or immoral, and desirable or undesirable. And this kind of argument mostly tackled are moral, legal, religious, and aesthetic arguments. Example statement: it is morally wrong to torture a human being for fun, because this is a violation of his or her human right. Every human being should be treated with respect and dignity. There is no known society or culture in the world that will sanction the torture of a human being for fun. The conclusion, it is morally wrong to torture a human being for fun, is supported by reasons that is either empirical or evaluative, similar to a moral rule. As a moral rule, the support offered to the conclusion by the premises is very strong. In the informal logic, when you accept the premises as correct, then you must also accept that the conclusion is correct. Now for the last topic, we have the theory of appraisal, which answers the questions: how should an argument be evaluated and criticized? How do we determine whether a premise is relevant or not? What are the appropriate standards for measuring argument's strength? The basic aim of the theory of appraisal is to provide criteria for judging the strength of support offered by the premises to the claim of the conclusion. Because it is said that a good theory of appraisal must be able to sort out various kinds of epistemic claims. Also, it must be able to determine the required evidence or justification to establish the claim. But what must be examined in the evaluation of argument strength? First, the nature of the claim of the conclusion, which can either be analytic, empirical, or evaluative. And next, the required evidence or justification to prove the claim of the conclusion, which must be 50% plus 1 of the population. And what is the criteria for evaluation? If the evidence offered by the premise intended to verify, confirm, or justify the claim of conclusion coincide with the required evidence, then the argument is conclusive. The closer you are to the required evidence, the stronger your argument becomes. There are 6 degrees of support used in evaluative arguments, which is very strong, strong, moderately strong, weak, poor, and no support at all. Now, how can we determine if an argument is relevant or not? Similar with the criteria mentioned, a premise is relevant to the conclusion if it can verify, confirm, and justify the claim. The stronger the support, the greater the relevance. Hence, the theory of appraisal can only be studied from the perspective of different types of arguments, because the criteria for evaluation and criticism must be directed to the type of argument under consideration. Now, we have the standards for measuring argument strength. First is the empirical argument. The criteria for judging the strength of an empirical argument is measured in terms of the evidence offered by the premises to verify the truth or probability of the conclusion. In this type, the strength of the relation between premises and the conclusion may be susceptible to degrees. More likely than not, Isabel comes from a poor family, because Isabel is a UP freshman batch 1998, and most freshman batch 1998 come from poor families. Next is the analytic argument. The criteria for judging the strength of an analytic argument is based on the stability of the truth of the analytic statement. This type of argument is not susceptible to degrees. Example statement: eagles have feathers and all animals with feathers are birds. Therefore, all eagles are birds. Lastly, we have the evaluative argument. The criteria for judging the strength of an evaluative argument rests on the extent of public acceptance or intersubjective consensus about moral principles used to justify the claim. In this type of argument, the relationship between the premise set and the conclusion is loose and susceptible to variations from different audiences. Example statement: Pedro should not be punished. Although he is accused of a crime, he is innocent, and we should never punish an innocent person. To sum up, conclusions of empirical argument comes from hasty generalization, while conclusions from the analytic argument comes from its analytic definition or some well-formed formula of some formal science. And for the evaluative argument, its conclusion is based on the extent of public acceptance. And with that, we have reached the end of Unit 4, Module 2. Now, just a quick recap. In conclusion, deductive arguments aim to provide specific conclusions. Formal logic is focused on revealing the essence of the arguments which formal logicians believe to gain them from the logical structure or argument form of the arguments, while informal logic is concerned with providing non-formal guidelines for analyzing natural arguments that we commonly use in everyday discourse. Overall, these are intended to aid us in making valid arguments and in avoiding the usage of invalid ones, so that we can have a better argumentations as we exercise our critical thinking skills further. Like what Sherlock Holmes said, it is a capital mistake to theorize before you have all the evidence. It biases the judgment. Valid and invalid arguments has a specific usage and purposes which can be utilized in our everyday discourse or during the formal ones. So we as critical thinkers must be able to determine when and where to use those arguments. And that ends my presentation. Thank you for listening.